My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 29. 8 months ago, I was pulled from a crumpled car on the side of Route 9 with a broken collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, and a newborn daughter who hadn't taken her first breath yet. The paramedics cut her out on the roadside. She weighed 5 pounds, 4 ounces. She cried exactly once, and then they took her away so fast I couldn't see her face. The first call I made from the hospital bed was to my mother. She picked up on the second ring. Her first question wasn't, "Are you alive?" It wasn't, "Where's the baby?" It was it your fault?" I spent 4 days in that hospital. My parents visited once. For 11 minutes. They brought no flowers, no food, no bag for the baby. What they brought was a question. And what they said before they left, I have spent every day since trying to understand. My grandfather was the one who showed up. 71 years old, bad hip, drove 40 minutes in the dark. He walked into that hospital room, looked at me in that bed with tubes in my arm and a daughter in the NICU down the hall, and he said 7 words. 7 words that changed everything that came after. But before I tell you what he said, please take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this story is speaking to something real for you. And drop your location and the time in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're listening from. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Not the crash, before the crash. Before the baby, before everything fell apart so cleanly that it almost looked like it had been planned. My name before I got married was Nora Delaney. I grew up in Harwick, New Hampshire. Population 6,200, 1 main street, 1 public school, 1 Catholic church that my mother attended every Sunday like it was a second job. My parents, Patrick and Colleen Delaney, had been married for 31 years. Patrick sold insurance. Colleen ran the front desk at the pediatric clinic on Maple and had opinions about everything and voiced all of them. I was their second child. My brother Connor, 34 now, was their first. Connor was the easy one. Connor played varsity baseball, went to UNH on a partial scholarship, married a woman named Bridget, who Colleen described as exactly right. He lives 11 minutes from my parents. He has Sunday dinners with them. He named his first son Patrick after our father. I left Harwick at 18 and didn't look back hard enough. University of Vermont, communications degree, a string of editorial assistant jobs in Boston, and then, at 24, I met Marcus Callahan at a friend's rooftop party in Somerville. Marcus was 30, a structural engineer, calm in a way I'd never seen up close. He laughed quietly, listened fully, said what he meant. I fell in love with him in the specific way you fall in love when you've spent your whole life around people who never quite say what they mean. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged. We got married in September, a vineyard in Vermont. Ceremony at 40 guests, no church. Colleen cried. Not the happy kind. She didn't say anything about the church. She didn't have to. The look she gave me when I told her the venue was enough. Patrick just nodded, the way he always nodded when Colleen had already decided something, and he was waiting for the weather to pass. Marcus and I settled in Concord. We were happy in the quiet way. People are happy when they've built something together on purpose. We talked about children the way you talk about something you both want but aren't rushing. Then, at 28, we found out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned. It also wasn't unwelcome. Marcus sat down on the kitchen floor and cried, the good kind, the overwhelmed kind. And I stood there watching him and thought, this is the man I'm going to raise a child with. That thought settled into my chest like something permanent. I called my mother. I expected, at the bare minimum, the performance of happiness. What I got was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. How far along are you? 8 weeks. Another pause. Is Marcus excited? He's thrilled. Okay, she exhaled. Well, that's a lot to process. That was the whole conversation. She didn't ask about my health. Didn't ask about my due date. Didn't say congratulations. Patrick called 2 hours later. He said congratulations in the way people say it when someone else told them to call. We talked for 4 minutes about nothing. I told myself they needed time to adjust. I told myself this was just Colleen being Colleen. I'd been telling myself those things for 29 years. The habit was too deep to quit overnight. The pregnancy was hard from the beginning. Morning sickness that lasted until week 16. Blood pressure that kept climbing into ranges that made my OB frown at her clipboard. By week 28, she used a word I didn't like. Preeclampsia, elevated risk. Close monitoring. Modified bed rest by week 32. Marcus worked from home 3 days a week. He cooked every meal. He drove me to every appointment. He set up a reading chair next to the bed so he could sit with me in the evenings and we could talk about names and paint colors and the specific kind of tiny shoes that had no practical purpose but made both of us feel like the future was something we could hold. We'd decided on a name, Maeve, after Marcus's grandmother, who had died 2 years before. We met and who he described as the most honest person he'd ever known. My mother visited once during the pregnancy. Week 24, she sat in my living room for 2 hours, commented on the paint color I'd chosen for the nursery, called it very modern, and asked twice whether I was sure I wanted to go back to work after the baby. When she left, she hugged me at the door and said, "Try to rest, not, you look beautiful, not, I can't wait to meet her. Try to rest." I stood on the porch and watched her drive away and thought about how some people show love the way you show a card trick. All the effort goes into the concealment. My grandfather, Emmett Delaney, was the one who called every week. Dad's father, 71, widowed 6 years, lived alone in the house in Harwick where my father grew up. He called every Sunday at 7 in the evening, right after his dinner. He'd ask how I was sleeping, how the baby was moving, whether Marcus was eating enough. He'd tell me what was blooming in his garden. He'd ask if I needed anything, and then actually wait to hear the answer. When I told him we'd named her Maeve, he went quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a strong name. She'll have something to live up to." I said, "I think she's already working on it." He laughed. The real kind, the kind that doesn't need anything back. Week 36, a Tuesday, late October, the leaves already gone from the trees along Route 9. I was driving back from a prenatal appointment in Concord, 40 minutes from home. Marcus had offered to come. I'd said no, it was a routine check. I'd be back by 3. The appointment wasn't entirely routine. My blood pressure had jumped. My OB wanted me to go directly to the hospital. I called Marcus from the parking lot. He was already leaving work. He said he'd meet me there. I don't remember the car that crossed the center line. I remember the light through the windshield, the sound, the sudden stillness, and then voices I didn't recognize and cold air I couldn't explain, and a pain in my left side that was so complete it had its own color. What I was told later, in pieces, by nurses and then by Marcus, and then much later by a police report, I read alone in our kitchen. A driver ran a red light at the Route 9 intersection and clipped my front passenger side hard enough to spin the car into the guardrail. The airbag deployed, my seatbelt held, but the impact, combined with the elevated blood pressure, triggered an emergency. Maeve was delivered on the roadside by an EMT named Greta, who had been doing this job for 19 years and had never once, she told me later, delivered a baby in a ditch in October. Maeve weighed 5 pounds, 4 ounces. Her APGAR score at 1 minute was low enough that they moved fast. By the time I arrived at Concord Hospital by ambulance, she was already in the NICU and I hadn't seen her face. I had a broken collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, a left wrist fracture, and a room on the 3rd floor where the nurses were kind and the ceiling was white, and I lay there for the first hours of my daughter's life, unable to hold her. Marcus arrived before my parents did. He sat in the chair beside my bed and held my good hand and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "She's breathing. She's fighting." And the way he said it, steady and sure, like a man who had decided that this was the only version of the story that existed, I held on to that sentence like a rope. My parents arrived at 8 p.m. They'd driven from Harwick, 2.5 hours. I heard Colleen's voice in the hallway before I saw her, not panicked, directed. She was asking the nurse something about parking validation. They came in together. Patrick first, then Colleen, who stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me the way you look at a car after an accident, assessing the damage before you decide what it's worth. "How are you feeling?" Patrick asked. "Broken," I said. "But okay." Colleen folded her arms. She looked at Marcus, then at me. "Was it your fault?" Marcus's hand tightened around mine. "No, Mom, someone ran a red light." "Because you were driving?" It wasn't a question. It was a filing, a fact she was placing into a folder she'd already labeled. "Yes, I was driving." She nodded once. "You should have let Marcus take you." Marcus stood up slowly from the chair. He's not a man who raises his voice. He didn't then. He just stood up, looked at my mother and said, "Colleen, your daughter is in a hospital bed. Her daughter is in the NICU. If you have something useful to say it. If not, we can do this another time." Colleen blinked. Patrick said nothing. Patrick's silence was its own language, fluent and consistent, and I had spent 29 years learning to read it. It said, "I agree, but I won't say so." They stayed 11 minutes. I counted. Colleen straightened the blanket at my feet once, which was the closest thing to tenderness she offered. She said she hoped the baby would be fine, in the tone of someone leaving a voicemail. They said they'd check in tomorrow. They left. I didn't cry until they were gone. Then I cried until Marcus said my name softly, twice, and I stopped. At 11:15 that night, I heard the door. I thought it was a nurse. It wasn't. It was my grandfather, Emmett Delaney, still in his barn coat, cap in his hand, his bad hip making the walk from the door to my bedside slow and deliberate. He sat down in the chair Marcus had vacated an hour earlier to go check on Maeve. He looked at my face for a long moment. Then he looked at the tubes in my arm, then back at my face. "Nora." His voice was low, like furniture that doesn't move when the wind blows. "Hi, Grandpa. How bad?" "Collarbone, ribs, wrist, concussion, the baby's in the NICU." He nodded slowly. He folded his cap between his hands. "She breathing?" "Yes." He exhaled, long and deliberate, like setting something down. Then he said it, the 7 words. He looked at me and said, "You're not going through this alone. Ever." Not, "Everything will be fine." Not, "I'm sure she'll be okay." Not the clean, convenient reassurances that people offer when they want to close the subject. Just that. A promise in 7 words. And unlike every promise I'd heard in that room that day, I believed it. Maeve spent 11 days in the NICU. 11 days of me sitting in a rocking chair next to a plastic bassinet with wires attached to my daughter's chest, watching numbers on a screen and learning to read them like a second language. Heart rate, oxygen, saturation, respiratory effort. The nurses taught me what was normal and what needed attention, and I learned fast because learning was the only thing I could do. Marcus was there every day, all day, until the hospital gently suggested he go home and sleep. He went home and didn't sleep. I know because he called me at 2 a.m. twice, just to hear me breathing, just to check. Emmett came every other day. He never stayed long. He'd sit for an hour, look at Maeve through the NICU window when they let him, drink terrible hospital coffee without complaining, and then go. Before he left each time, he'd put his hand on my shoulder for exactly 1 second. Not a hug, not a speech, just a hand, present and sure. My parents came once. Day 3. They stood outside the NICU window for 5 minutes. Colleen said she looked small. Patrick said she had Marcus's nose. They didn't stay long enough to hold her. They said they'd be back when she was home and more settled. As though a newborn in a NICU was an inconvenience they were waiting to schedule around. I didn't say anything. I thanked them for coming. I had been trained since childhood to thank people for the bare minimum, as though gratitude was the price of not being disappointed. Connor texted from Boston. "Heard about the crash. Rough. How's the baby?" I wrote back, "She's fighting." He sent a thumbs-up emoji. That was the extent of my brother's presence in those 11 days. Bridget sent a gif of flowers. 2 weeks after the accident, Maeve came home. 5 pounds, 11 ounces. Pink, furious about everything, absolutely perfect. Marcus carried her into the house in the car seat and set her on the kitchen table, and we both just stood there, looking at her for a full minute without speaking, like we were afraid that if we moved, the moment would crack. That night Emmett called, "She home?" "She's home." A pause, and then a sound I hadn't heard in years. My grandfather, laughing, the real kind, quiet and warm, like something settling into place. "Good," he said. "That's good." The first month was survival. Maeve ate every 2 hours. My collarbone hadn't healed enough for me to lift her easily, which meant every middle of the night feed was a quiet negotiation between my body and my desperation. Marcus became expert at the handoff, the transfer, the precise geometry of getting a 5-pound baby from bassinet to nursing position without waking her before she was ready or jolting my shoulder past the point of tolerance. We were tired in the deep structural way, the kind of tired that lives in your bones. My mother called on day 4, not to ask about Maeve, not to ask about my shoulder. She called to ask if we'd set a date for the baptism. Mom, the baby is 4 days old. The church book's up. Father Dennis is very popular. I haven't thought about the baptism. A pause, weighted with implication. You're not thinking about skipping it. I haven't thought about anything that isn't feeding schedules and pediatric appointments. Nora. Her voice went to the tone I knew from childhood, the one that said, "This is who we are, and you are embarrassing us by forgetting. This is important. This is how we do things." Mom, I have to go. She's fussing. She wasn't fussing. I set the phone face down on the counter and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard where the last of October's dead leaves were piled against the fence. And I thought about what it would take to have a mother who called to say, "You're doing an incredible job," just once, without a request attached. I had never received that call. I was starting to understand I never would. Marcus could see it happening, the slow compression I was under. Not just the physical recovery, not just the newborn exhaustion. The other thing, the older, heavier thing. The weight of being the daughter who was never quite right. He didn't name it. He just... One evening when Maeve was finally asleep and I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing, made me a cup of tea I didn't ask for and sat across from me and said, "You're allowed to be angry at them." I looked at him. "You keep swallowing it," he said. "I can hear it." I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "If I start, I'm not sure I'll be able to stop." He put his hand over mine. "Then don't stop." I didn't cry. Not then. But something inside me moved, like a door that had been painted shut for years, starting to give along one edge. Week 6. Maeve's first pediatric appointment. Clean bill of health, 7 pounds even. The doctor called her a fighter. I cried in the parking lot, the good kind, the releasing kind, with Marcus's arm around me and Maeve asleep in the car seat in the back, like she'd done this before. That afternoon, Emmett came over for the first time since she'd been home. He sat in the armchair in the living room, and I put Maeve in his arms and watched him look at her. He didn't say anything for a while. He just looked. Then he said, "She has Delaney eyes, the stubborn kind." "Is there another kind?" I said. He laughed. Then he looked at me. "How are Patrick and Colleen with her?" I took a breath. They visited twice, for about an hour each time. He nodded slowly, the way he nods when he already knew the answer, but wanted to give me the chance to say it. "And how are you with that?" I looked at my daughter in his arms. I'm trying to figure out how to be enough for her when my own parents couldn't manage it with me. The sentence surprised me when it came out. I hadn't said it that plainly before, not even to Marcus. Emmett looked at me for a long moment. "You are already more than enough for her. That's not a question, Nora." I swallowed hard. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." He adjusted Maeve in his arms with the practiced ease of a man who had held many babies in his life. "I've been watching you since you were born. You have been enough your entire life. That's not about them. They just couldn't see it." I went to the kitchen to get him a cup of coffee. I stood at the counter for 2 full minutes breathing before I came back. Month 2. Colleen called with a new agenda. She'd been talking to Father Dennis. She'd picked a date for the baptism, 3rd Sunday in January, 11 a.m. Mass. I said, "You booked a date without asking me?" "I thought you'd be grateful. You said you hadn't thought about it." "That's different from giving you permission to plan it." "It's just a date, Nora. You can say no if you want to be difficult." There it was. The word she kept in reserve, filed under D, pulled out whenever I failed to agree. Difficult. The word that meant you have a preference that inconveniences me. "Marcus and I will talk about it and get back to you." "Father Dennis is very booked." "We'll talk about it." I hung up and told Marcus. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do we even want a church baptism?" It was the first time either of us had said it out loud. We looked at each other across the kitchen. Maeve was in the bouncer on the floor between us, watching the mobile above her like it was the most interesting thing in the world, which for her it was. "I don't know," I said. "I think I've been doing what they want for so long, I genuinely don't know what I want." Marcus said, "Then that's where we start. What do you want for her? Not them, not the church, you." I thought about it. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about it while feeding Maeve at 3 a.m. when the house was quiet and the only sound was her and my heartbeat and the occasional car on the street outside. I thought about what I actually believed, what I actually wanted my daughter to grow up knowing, what kind of beginning I wanted to give her. I thought about Emmett, sitting in that armchair with her in his arms, telling me she had the stubborn kind of Delaney eyes. I thought about Marcus on the floor of our kitchen the day we found out I was pregnant. I thought about an EMT named Greta, 19 years on the job, delivering a baby in October on the side of a road and handing her to paramedics with hands that didn't shake. I wanted Maeve to grow up knowing she was wanted. Completely, unconditionally, without condition or liturgy or the approval of people who had to schedule their visits. I called Colleen on a Thursday morning. Marcus was in his home office. Maeve was asleep. "Mom, we're not doing the church baptism." Silence. "We're going to do a small family ceremony at home, our home, just the people who have been here." "That's not a baptism. It's what we're doing. Father Dennis is going to have to book someone else." A longer silence, then cold and precise. "This is Marcus. This is me. Nora, this is how we raised you." "I know. I'm raising her differently." She hung up. She called back 4 minutes later. The second call was not a conversation. It was a verdict. She told me that if we weren't baptizing Maeve in the church, then she and Patrick needed to step back and think about what kind of relationship they wanted to have with a household that didn't share their values. Those were her exact words. Step back. Think about what kind of relationship a household that didn't share their values. My newborn daughter was 8 weeks old. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay. If that's your decision, okay." Another silence. She'd expected a fight. I think she'd wanted one. A fight would have let her be righteous. My okay gave her nothing to push against. She hung up again. I set the phone on the counter. I walked into the living room. I picked up Maeve from the bassinet even though she was asleep, held her against my good shoulder, and stood at the window for a long time looking at the street, outside where the first snow of the season was just beginning to come down. If this story is landing somewhere close to home, hit the like button and subscribe. I'll be here, and I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been given an ultimatum by your own family over something that was never theirs to decide? Tell me. I'm reading every single one. Now back to the story. I called Emmett that evening. I told him everything. The date Colleen had booked without asking. My answer. The ultimatum, my okay. He listened through all of it without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. Not the uncomfortable kind, the thinking kind. "She called it stepping back," he said. "Yes. What she means is she's waiting to see if you'll fold." "I know. Are you going to?" "No." Another pause and then a sound I couldn't entirely read. Not quite a laugh. Something quieter. "Good," he said. "Then, I want to come to the ceremony." "Of course, Grandpa. You were always going to be there." "I want to bring something," he said. "If you'll let me." I said, "Bring whatever you want." I didn't ask what it was. With Emmett, the reveal was always worth the wait. The ceremony was the second Sunday in February. Snow on the ground, the house warm. The smell of the casserole Marcus had put in the oven at noon. The guest list was 8 people. Marcus's parents, David and Joan, who had flown in from Portland and who had been calling every week since the crash to check on all 3 of us. Marcus's sister Danny, who had driven from Providence and who made Maeve laugh for the first time by blowing raspberries at her over the kitchen table. My friend Leah from my Boston years, who had mailed a handwritten letter to the hospital when she heard about the accident, and who I had cried over in the good way. Emmett, Patrick and Colleen were not there. They had not been invited. That was a choice I made with complete clarity and no guilt, which was a new feeling for me and one I intended to keep. Connor was not there. He had texted 3 days before to say he and Bridget had a prior commitment. He didn't ask what kind of ceremony it was. He didn't ask how Maeve was doing. He sent a gift card to a baby store 2 weeks later, the automated kind, no message. We did the ceremony in the living room. No script, no liturgy, no script. Marcus and I stood with Maeve between us, and we said what we wanted her to know. That she was wanted before she arrived, and would be wanted every day after. That she had come into the world fighting, and that we would spend our lives making sure she always had something to fight for. That love in this house would not be conditional, would not be withheld, would not be used as a lever. David and Joan cried. Danny cried. Leah cried. Marcus cried quietly, the way he does, like the feeling is too large for the room. Then Emmett stood up. He was holding something. A small wooden box, old, the kind with a brass clasp, the kind that belongs in a drawer you only open on important occasions. He walked over to where I was holding Maeve, and he held the box out to me. "Open it," he said. I passed Maeve to Marcus. I took the box and opened the clasp. Inside, on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a ring. Small, gold, with a single stone, deep green. Not expensive, not new. Old in the way that things are old when they have been held by many hands. "That was your grandmother's," Emmett said. "Eleanor's. She left it to me when she died, and I've kept it in my dresser for 6 years, not knowing what to do with it." He looked at Maeve in Marcus's arms. "She told me once, give it to whoever needs it most. I think she meant it for the girl in your family who doesn't get told often enough that she belongs." I stopped breathing for a moment. "She wanted to meet you," he said. "Eleanor. She said Nora was going to be the interesting one." He smiled, the quiet kind. She was right. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for Danny to find a tissue. Long enough for Marcus to quietly say my name once, gently, the way you say someone's name when you want to make sure they're still there. I looked at my grandfather. 71 years old, bad hip, barn coat, holding a wooden box across the living room in February while snow came down outside the window. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just let her wear it someday when she's old enough." I put the ring on my right hand. It fit exactly. My parents found out about the ceremony from Connor, who found out from someone in Harwick, because Harwick is that kind of town. Colleen called on a Wednesday, 9 days after the fact. The call was controlled at first, precisely controlled, the way a pressure cooker is controlled. She said she had heard we'd had a ceremony. I confirmed it. She asked who was there. I told her. She noted the absence of her name and Patrick's. I said yes, they hadn't been there. She asked why. I said, "Because you told me you needed to step back." "I didn't mean it like that." "You said the words, Mom." I was upset. "You were making a condition. You said if we didn't baptize Maeve in the church, you needed to step back and think about what kind of relationship you wanted with us. That was the condition. I accepted it." A pause. "You took it too literally." I take words literally when they're spoken clearly and on purpose. "We missed our granddaughter's ceremony." "Yes? How can you be so cold about that?" I looked at Maeve, asleep in the bassinet, 3 feet away from me. I looked at the ring on my right hand. I thought about 11 minutes in a hospital room. I thought about, was it your fault? I thought about a baptism date booked without my knowledge, and an ultimatum delivered when my daughter was 8 weeks old. "I'm not cold," I said. "I'm clear. Those aren't the same thing." She tried a different angle. She asked if Marcus had put me up to it. I said no. She asked if his family had influenced me. I said no. She said she felt like she didn't know me anymore. I said, "You've never really tried to." That one landed. I heard her breath catch. "That's not fair," she said. "You asked me a question in the hospital about whether the accident was my fault. Your daughter had just been in a car crash. Your granddaughter had just been born on the side of a highway, and your first question was whether it was my fault." Silence. "That's what I mean," I said. "That's been the pattern my whole life. Something happens to me, and the first thing you do is calculate whose fault it is. I'm tired of being the sum of my mistakes in your ledger. Maeve doesn't know that version of me. I'd like to keep it that way." She hung up. I sat with the silence for a while. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like standing in a room after you finally moved the furniture to where it was always supposed to go. Quiet. Right. a little unfamiliar but already more like home. Patrick called 2 days later. He does that. Waits for the storm to pass, then sends a scout. Your mother is upset. I know. She feels left out. She opted out, Dad. There's a difference. A long exhale. Nora, she's your mother. I know who she is. This is tearing the family apart. I thought about that for a moment. Dad, can I ask you something honestly? Sure. When I was in that hospital bed and she asked if the accident was my fault, what were you thinking? A pause so long I thought he might hang up the way he had when I asked him hard questions before. But he didn't. He said quietly, I was thinking she shouldn't have said that. Why didn't you say so? Another long pause. I don't know. That's the thing, Dad. That's always been the thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is there anything I can do? Be honest with her. Tell her what she costs the people who love her. I can't fix that from here. Only you can. He didn't respond to that, but he also didn't hang up. We talked for another few minutes about nothing in particular, and when we said goodbye, it was without the usual static, the held-back thing that usually crackled between us. He said, Give Maeve a hug from me. I said I would. I don't know if he talked to Colleen. Probably he didn't. Patrick's path of least resistance was a road he'd been walking for 31 years, and it had grooves by now. But he called. That counted for something. I let it count. March. Maeve turned 3 months old and discovered her own hands, which became the most interesting thing in the world to her. She would lie on her back on the playmat and stare at her fingers moving with an expression of profound concentration, like she was working out a theorem. Marcus called it her scientist face. I called it her grandmother's face, meaning Emmett's mother, who I knew only from photographs, a woman who apparently spent 30 years as a high school biology teacher and had an opinion about everything and was right about most of it. I went back to work. Part-time at first, then full remote. The editorial job I'd held for 3 years. My collarbone had healed well. The wrist was slower. I learned to type with modification. Emmett came every other Sunday. He brought things. Not expensive things. Vegetables from his garden when the season started. A jar of the apple butter he made every fall in a batch large enough to last through winter. Once a book, an old paperback, the pages tan and soft. A collection of Irish folk tales he'd had since his own childhood. He put it on the shelf in Maeve's room and said, For when she's old enough to want the long stories. I was building something, I realized. Not just a life. Something more specific than that. A table, maybe. The kind with enough chairs for everyone who had actually shown up. I was learning, slowly, which chairs belonged and which had been left there by people who never really intended to sit down. My friend Leah came up from Boston one weekend, and we took Maeve for a walk along the river, and I told her everything, the whole of it. From the hospital room to the ceremony to the ring to the phone call with my father. She listened the way good friends listen, without filling in the gaps, without preloading her response while I was still talking. When I finished, she said, You sound different. Different how? She thought about it, like you've stopped apologizing for taking up space. I turned that over in my mind for the rest of the walk. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said to me in years. April, 6 months after the crash. A Tuesday evening, Maeve asleep. Marcus reading in the other room. Me at the kitchen table with a cup of tea when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Harwick area code. I opened it. It was from Colleen's friend Beverly, a woman who had been a fixture at every Delaney family event since I was a child, the kind of woman who knows everyone's business and keeps it under a thin layer of friendly concern. The text read, Nora, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I've been hearing things from your mom lately, and I just want you to know that a lot of us in town have been thinking about you. What you went through sounds incredibly hard. Your grandfather talks about you and that baby girl all the time. He showed me her photo last Sunday at church. She's beautiful. You should know that. I read it twice. Then I opened Emmett's contact and called him. He picked up on the first ring. Nora, did you show Beverly a photo of Maeve? A pause that I was fairly sure contained a smile. I may have. How many people have you shown? A longer pause. There's a coffee shop at 9 a.m. on Sundays after church. It's a small town. Grandpa, she looks like you, he said. People should know. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea going cold in front of me and something expanding in my chest that took me a moment to name. It was the feeling of being claimed, the feeling of someone deciding, without being asked, that you were worth telling strangers about. Not because it was convenient or impressive, but because it was simply true, and they wanted it known. I had gone my whole life in a family that kept me quiet, edited me out, tucked me into the back of the frame. And here was my grandfather at Sunday coffee showing strangers a photo of my daughter because she looked like me, and that was something worth saying. "Thank you," I told him. "She has your eyes," he said, "the stubborn kind." 5 months after the ceremony, Colleen called again. No ultimatum this time, no calculation. She called on a Sunday morning and the voice was different, smaller, like the performance had gotten too heavy to keep carrying. She said, "I'd like to meet her, properly, if you'll let me." I didn't answer right away. I looked at Maeve in her bouncer, 7 months old now, solid, loud, completely certain she was the center of the universe, which in our house she was. "I'd like to understand some things first," I said. "Okay, the hospital, the question you asked." A pause. "I know. That's not enough." "I know that too." A long exhale. "I was scared. She was in the NICU and you were broken and I didn't know how to be there, so I looked for something to be angry at instead." It was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the admission of a mechanism, and that was further than she'd ever come before. "And the ceremony," I said. I overstepped. "You made a condition." "I know. You used my daughter as leverage." A silence, tighter now. "I didn't see it that way." "I know you didn't. That's part of the problem." She didn't hang up, that was something. We talked for 40 minutes. Not perfectly, not cleanly. We talked the way two people talk when they've been circling a subject for 29 years and have finally decided to walk toward it instead. She cried twice. I didn't. I had done my crying in other rooms, on other nights, and I had used it all up on things worth crying over. By the end, we hadn't fixed anything. Fixing isn't something that happens in one call. But we had said things out loud that had previously only existed as weather, as pressure, as the particular silence between two people who love each other badly. She asked if she could visit. I said I'd talk to Marcus. Marcus said it was my call. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I called her back and said yes. She came on a Saturday. She held Maeve for 45 minutes and didn't say a word. About baptism or church or what anyone in Harwick thought. She just held her. She sang to her low and half-remembered. A song I recognized from childhood, something she used to sing when I was sick. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching and felt the complicated thing I always feel about my mother. The grief and the love and the exhaustion and the stubborn unwillingness to stop hoping. All of it at the same time, which is, I've come to understand, what it means to love someone who is difficult to love. Patrick came with her. He didn't say much. He held Maeve for 15 minutes and told her she had smart eyes. He said it to me, briefly, on the way out the door. She's great. Nora, you're doing great. 4. Words of praise was a record for Patrick. Delaney and I accepted them with the same grace. I'd learned to accept everything from him. Something is better than nothing. Sometimes something is all you get. 8 months after Meadow Creek. No, wait. 8 months after Route 9, I keep reaching for the wrong story because the shape of them is similar. The shape of being turned away by people who should have kept the door open. The shape of finding, in the rubble, the person who actually shows up. Emmett came for Maeve's first Thanksgiving. He drove 40 minutes in the dark, which is becoming a pattern with him. Marcus made a turkey that was, objectively, the best thing I have ever eaten. Danny came from Providence. David and Joan came from Portland. The table had 8 chairs and all of them were full of people who had chosen to be there. Not people who had been guilted or pressured or shamed into showing up. Maeve sat in her high chair at the corner of the table and presided over everything, with the calm authority of someone who has decided this is her kingdom and everyone in it is exactly who she needs. Emmett sat at the end of the table and watched her the way he watches things that matter to him, quietly, like he's committing the scene to memory. After dinner when Maeve was asleep, and the dishes were done, and Marcus and Danny were on the couch watching. Something neither of them was really watching. I sat with Emmett at the kitchen table with the last of the wine in the house going quiet around us. "How are you?" he said, not small talk. The real question. "I'm good," I said. And I meant it in the full sense. "Not fine, not managing, good." He nodded. "I start therapy in January," I said. "I found someone who specializes in family systems. She says what I've been carrying has a name. What's it called? Conditional belonging. The belief that you have to earn your place in your own family.